Before dawn on the 7th of August 1944, 4 German panzer divisions rolled west in the dark toward the town of Mortain in Normandy. Roughly 120 tanks and assault guns moved under a low ceiling of fog that hid them from the sky. Their orders came from Hitler himself. Reach the coast at Avranches, about 20 miles to the west, split the American front in two, and cut off George Patton's Third Army where it had broken out into open country. For a few hours the fog held and the plan worked. That was before first light on the 7th of August. By the middle of that same day the fog had burned off, and the sky over the German columns belonged to American P-47 Thunderbolts. This is the account of Operation Luettich, the last great German counterattack in Normandy, the fighter bomber that met it in daylight, and the question of how much that aircraft actually destroyed. Normandy, the final week of July 1944. For 7 weeks after the landings, the Allied armies had been pinned in the hedgerow country of the Bocage, a landscape of high earth banks and sunken lanes that favoured the defender, and stripped away the Allied advantage in armour and air power. On the 25th of July, the 1st United States Army opened Operation Cobra west of Saint-Lô. Heavy bombers carpeted a narrow strip of German front, and American armour pushed through the gap. Within days, the German line in the west had come apart. Avranches fell on the 30th of July, and the door at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula swung open. Patton's Third Army poured through it and fanned out into Brittany and toward the Loire. Cobra had opened with a carpet of heavy bombs along the Perriers to Saint-Lô road, and some of those bombs fell short onto the American units waiting to advance, causing casualties in their own ranks and costing the life of a visiting senior officer, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. The bombing still tore a hole in the German defence that the panzer divisions could not seal. Within a week, the collapse in the west was total. Coutances, Avranches, and the bridges beyond them fell in quick order, and American columns were driving south and east faster than the German command could track. That breakthrough created the situation Hitler chose to attack. The whole of Patton's advance was being supplied through the bottleneck at Avranches. A single hard thrust to the sea there, on paper, would sever the Third Army from its fuel and ammunition and leave it stranded in open country. Field Marshal Guenther von Kluge, commanding the German forces in the west, wanted to pull back toward the Seine before the pocket forming around his armies could close. Hitler ordered the opposite. He directed the 7th Army to gather its armour and drive west, straight back through Mortain to Avranches. Kluge objected that the divisions were worn down and that stripping the front to mass them would only expose them. The order stood. There was one more problem the German planners could not solve. The Allies were reading their mail. Allied code breakers working the ultra-intelligence had intercepted and decrypted the orders for the Mortain attack by the 4th of August, 2 days before it began. The warning was real, but it reached the 1st United States Army headquarters too late to be pushed all the way down to the specific units in Mortain. The German attack still fell on the 30th Infantry Division as a shock at the front, even though the senior American command already knew, in outline, that a blow at Mortain was coming. That combination, tactical surprise on the ground but strategic foreknowledge at the top, shaped everything that followed. The Americans could not stop the first rush, but they were not caught off balance where it counted. The force assembled for the attack was drawn from the 47th Panzer Corps under General Hans von Funk, part of the 7th Army commanded by General Paul Hauser. It pulled together elements of 4 to 5 panzer divisions. The 2nd Panzer Division and the 116th Panzer Division supplied the northern and central thrust. Elements of 2 elite formations, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, made up much of the armoured weight. In total, the Germans committed on the order of 120 tanks and assault guns to the opening blow. It was a smaller force than such an operation demanded, thrown together under a deadline, and its commanders knew it. The condition of those divisions was the weakness Kluge had pointed to. They had been fighting without pause since June, and the Cobra breakout had ground them down further. Tank strengths were far below establishment. Crews were tired, and the fuel that any armoured drive depended on was scarce across the whole German front in the west. A thrust to Avranches needed depth, reserves, and secure supply lines, and the 7th Army had none of the three. What it had was a direct order and a short window before the Allied pocket closed. General von Funk was told to attack with what he could gather, on a timetable set in Berlin rather than by the state of his own unit. The one advantage the Germans held was surprise, and they built the plan around darkness and weather. The columns moved off before dawn, without the long artillery preparation that normally announced a major attack. A morning fog lay across the valleys around Mortain and grounded the Allied air forces that had made daylight movement so costly for weeks. In the first hours it worked. Das Reich pushed into Mortain itself and drove the forward American positions out of the lower town. The 2nd Panzer Division made ground to the north. For a short window in the dark and mist, the German timetable held together. Holding the ground in the path of the attack was the United States 30th Infantry Division, which had taken over the Mortain sector only a day before. The town sat below a dominating height the Americans marked on their maps as Hill 314, a bare rounded summit that looked out over every road and approach for miles. 2 battalions worth of men from the division, most of them from the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, cut off on that hill when the Panzer Grenadiers swept around and behind them in the first hours. Roughly 700 men were surrounded on Hill 314 with limited ammunition, almost no food, and no line of retreat. They would hold the position for 5 days. American accounts later called them the Lost Battalion. The assault against the hill fell mainly to the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, which had surrounded the position, and to the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, which threw a regiment-sized force at the summit again and again over the following days. The surrounded Americans held on short rations and dwindling ammunition against those attacked. Resupply was a constant problem. Cargo aircraft tried to drop ammunition, food, and medical supplies onto the hilltop, but many of the loads drifted into German hands or landed out of reach. The most improvised solution came from the artillery itself. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion emptied smoke shells, packed them with plasma and morphine and medical supplies, and fired them onto the American perimeter so the wounded could be treated. Men who needed help were being supplied by the same guns that were breaking up the German attacks below. The reason that hill mattered so much was what the surrounded men could see. 2 forward artillery observers on the summit from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion had a clear view of the roads the German armour had to use. From that height they called down American artillery fire onto every column that tried to move through the valley below. Massed battalions of American guns, directed from the hilltop, turned the road junctions at Mortain into ground. The panzers could not cross freely. The German advance on the southern axis ground down under that fire before the sky ever cleared. The men on Hill 314 did not stop the whole offensive by themselves, but they broke the timing of it and held the shoulder of the American line in place. Then the weather changed. By late morning on the 7th of August the fog burned off, the ceiling lifted, and the German columns stood exposed on open roads with nowhere to hide. The condition the entire plan had depended on was gone by noon. What replaced it was the thing German drivers and tank crews had come to fear most in Normandy, a clear sky with Allied fighter bombers overhead. The aircraft that answered came from the American 9th Air Force and the Royal Air Force, working the same battlefield. Bradley asked General Elwood Quesada, known as Pete Quesada, commander of the 9th Tactical Air Command, to throw his fighter bombers against the exposed armour. Quesada's P-47 Thunderbolts, joined by the rocket-armed Typhoons of the Royal Air Force 2nd Tactical Air Force, went after the columns for the rest of the daylight hours. Relay after relay came in over Mortain, worked the stalled vehicles, pulled off to rearm and refuel, and came back. German troops on the ground had a single word for the fighter bomber that hunted them in daylight. They called it the Jabbo, short for Jagdbomber. The scale of the effort through that afternoon was heavy. Squadron after squadron of Thunderbolts and Typhoons cycled over the Mortain sector, so that fresh aircraft were almost always overhead as others turned for home. The German columns, jammed nose to tail on the narrow lanes with the lead vehicles halted, presented targets that were hard to miss. The rocket-armed Typhoons of the Royal Air Force worked the same roads the American Thunderbolts did, and in the accounts written afterward, the two aircraft were often credited together, their claims blurred into one figure. The pilots pressed their attacks low, into the range of German light anti-aircraft fire, which was the price of accuracy against vehicles. The day was not free, but for the German drivers below, the sky had become a place from which attack came without pause, and movement on the open road in daylight had become close to impossible. The method the 9th Tactical Air Command used at Mortain had been built in the weeks before, during the breakout, and Quesada was its architect. The system was called Armoured Column Cover. An experienced pilot rode on the ground in one of the lead tanks, in a Sherman fitted with an aircraft radio on the same very high-frequency band the pilots used. From inside the column he could talk directly to the flight overhead, name the target ahead, and put the aircraft onto it within minutes. Quesada kept 4 P-47s over a column at all times, working in relays of about 1 hour each, one flight handing the airspace to the next as it ran low on fuel. It gave a ground commander something no army had really had before, a fast air weapon he could aim by voice at whatever sat around the next bend. That system had not been improvised at Mortain. Quesada had built and tested it during the Cobra breakout in the last days of July, when the problem was keeping air support tied to fast-moving armour that outran the old, slow methods of calling for aircraft through layers of headquarters. Putting a pilot in the lead tank with a radio that talked straight to the flight overhead cut the delay from hours to minutes. By the time the German counterattack struck at Mortain, the technique was already proven, and the pilots and tank crews already knew how to use it. The 7th Army drove its armour into a sector where the American Air Arm had just spent a week learning to hit moving columns quickly, and it did so on a clear afternoon. Against the stalled columns at Mortain, the effect was immediate. Tanks caught on open roads with vehicles ahead of them, and behind them could not scatter. They were strafed with heavy machine gun fire, bombed, and hit with rockets through the afternoon. Crews left their vehicles and took cover in the ditches and hedgerows. Fuel and ammunition trucks moving up behind the armour were easy marks, and losing them stranded the tanks that depended on them. American pilots came back from the day over Mortain, claiming enormous numbers. Airmen reported destroying on the order of 1,100 vehicles on the 7th of August alone. That figure needs to be held carefully, and the reason will come at the end of this account. The aircraft doing the work was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt in the P-47D model that equipped the 9th Air Force fighter groups over Normandy. It was one of the largest and heaviest single-seat fighters of the war, and its build is what made it a ground attack weapon rather than only a dogfighter. At its heart sat a Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, an 18-cylinder power plant driving about 2,000 horsepower, and up to roughly 2,300 under war emergency power. That engine gave the aircraft a top speed of around 426 to 433 miles per hour, and a service ceiling near 42,000 feet. The Thunderbolt was big for a fighter of its day. It carried a wingspan of 40 feet, 9 inches, weighed close to 10,000 pounds empty, and could reach up to about 17,500 pounds fully loaded. That size brought two things that mattered over a battlefield. The first was firepower. The P-47 carried 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings, 4 to a side, a weight of fire that tore into soft-skinned vehicles, exposed crews, and thin engine deck. Under the wings and belly, it could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, or up to 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. The second thing the size brought was survivability. The big radial engine was air-cooled, with no vulnerable liquid cooling system to be punctured, and it could keep running with cylinders shot away. A fighter that pressed low over flak to attack tanks needed to absorb hits and carry its pilot home, and the Thunderbolt did that better than almost anything else in the theatre. Pilots trusted the aircraft for exactly this kind of work. The Thunderbolt could dive fast, carry a heavy load of ordnance to the target, and take return fire that would have brought down a lighter fighter. Ground attack was the most dangerous flying of the war, low and slow over guns that were shooting back, and the P-47's rugged airframe and air-cooled engine gave its pilot the best odds of coming home from it. Over Normandy, The American fighter groups had already turned the Thunderbolt into the workhorse of the daylight battlefield, hunting trains, trucks and armor across the German rear. By August, it was the aircraft the German army most associated with the misery of moving in daylight. Over Mortain, that combination is what the German columns faced through the afternoon of the 7th. The 8-gun batteries and the rockets were not reliable killers of heavy tank armor from the front. And that fact is central to the honest reckoning that follows. But against the whole body of a stalled panzer drive, the fuel trucks, the half-tracks, the towed guns, the supply columns and the crews caught in the open, the Thunderbolt was punishing. It kept the German armor pinned, off the roads, and unable to move by daylight. The counterattack failed quickly. Rather than an advance that gathered speed toward Avranches, the 7th of August became a day of stalled columns being worked over from the air and held in place by the guns on Hill 314. The northern thrust made only limited ground and stopped. The push through Mortain never reached open road to the west. Within about a day, the offensive had lost its momentum, and within roughly 48 hours it was broken as an operation. The German armour had been committed deep to the west and had gained almost nothing. Even as the attack stalled, Hitler ordered it renewed and reinforced rather than called off. Kluge, watching the divisions grind to a halt under the guns and the fighter bombers, understood that the moment for the thrust to Avranches had already passed, and that holding the armour in the west now only deepened the danger. The German command spent days pushing against a plan that had failed on its first afternoon, while the ground behind the panzer divisions kept narrowing. The order to keep attacking west did not change the result at Mortain. It only made the trap at Falaise worse, because the tanks that should have been pulling back east were still pointed the wrong way. That failure set a trap of a different kind. Every mile the panzer divisions had driven west toward Avranches was a mile deeper into a sack that was already forming around the 7th Army. To the north, the Anglo-Canadian forces were pressing south from Cam toward Falaise. To the south, Patton's 3rd Army had swung east and then north toward Argentan. The failed lunge at Mortain had pushed the strongest German armoured formations into the closing end of that pocket rather than out of it. Kluge's warning had been exactly this. The counterattack had not split the Americans. It had fed German armour into an encirclement. Falaise, the 2nd week of August 1944. Between the towns of Falaise, Argentan, Trun and Chambord, the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army under General Heinrich Eberbach were being squeezed into a shrinking area with a single narrowing gap to the east. Field Marshal Walter Model arrived to take over the German command in the west from Kluge in the middle of the crisis, but the situation was already beyond saving. Through the middle of August, the two armies tried to force their vehicles and men eastward through the gap between Tron and Chambord, while Allied artillery and aircraft fired into the corridor. The final block came from the Polish 1st Armoured Division. From the 19th of August it seized and held Hill 262, a height called Mont Ormel that the Poles nicknamed the Mace, sitting directly astride the German escape route near Chambord. For 3 days the Polish tankers held that ground against German columns trying to force their way east, and against SS units attacking from outside the pocket, trying to hold the door open. The Poles were nearly cut off themselves, low on ammunition and fuel, but they did not give up the height. From it, their guns and the massed Allied artillery fired into the corridor below, where the retreating German columns were packed onto a few roads. American and Polish troops linked up near Chambord, and the gap was effectively shut by the 21st of August. By the time the gap closed on the 21st of August, the German armies in Normandy had been shattered. The defensible figures are heavy on their own, something on the order of 10,000 to 15,000 casualties, roughly 40,000 to 50,000 men taken prisoner, and a comparable number who managed to escape east before the gap shut. The Germans lost somewhere between 350 and 500 tanks and assault guns in the pocket, along with close to 1,000 guns and many thousands of other vehicles. The 7th Army had largely ceased to exist as a fighting force. The failed attack at Mortain is what had driven it into that ground. Now the reckoning the airmen's claims demand. The story usually told is that Allied fighter bombers destroyed the German armour from the air, first at Mortain and then in the corridor at Falaise. When British and Canadian analysts actually went into the pocket after the fighting and counted, that story did not survive contact with the wrecks. The operational research section examined the destroyed German vehicles across the Falaise pocket and tried to assign a cause to each one. Out of the hundreds of armoured vehicles left behind, they could prove only 11 had actually been destroyed by air attack. Most of the German tanks and assault guns had been abandoned by their crews, out of fuel, or knocked out by ground fire and artillery, then left where they stood. The survey did not say air power had done nothing. About a third of the wrecked trucks in the pocket had been lost to air attack, and many more vehicles had been abandoned by crews who had good reason to fear what waited for them on the open road. But the specific claim that fighter bombers had destroyed hundreds of tanks did not hold up against account of the actual wrecks. Armour was hard to kill from the air. A tank was a small, armoured, moving target, and the rockets of 1944 were inaccurate, while machine gun fire and light bombs rarely penetrated the thick plate of a tank from above. The vehicles that filled the roads of the pocket had mostly run dry of fuel, thrown a track, or been knocked out by ground fire, and then been left where they stopped. Two more facts sharpen the point. The heavy airwork over the corridor of destruction at Falaise, the images of a road choked with wrecked German vehicles, was flown in large part by the rocket-firing Typhoons of the Royal Air Force, not by American Thunderbolts. And that Mortain, the weapon that broke the counterattack on the ground, was the American infantry holding Hill 314 and the massed artillery those observers directed, with the Thunderbolts and the Typhoons sharing the credit in the air. The number of tanks the fighter bombers actually destroyed at Mortain was a small fraction of the 1,100 vehicles the pilots claimed on the 7th of August. That is the honest measure of the P-47 at Mortain, and it is not a small one. The Thunderbolt's real weight was not in tank kills. It was in what it did to a panzer drive that had to move by daylight. It pinned the armour off the roads, drove crews into cover, destroyed the fuel and supply columns that kept the tanks running, and stranded the advance in the open until it died. It bought time for the men on Hill 314 and shielded the American forces as they closed the trap. Air power did not knock the German tanks out one by one. It took away the enemy's ability to manoeuvre, and in the summer of 1944, that was enough to turn a counterattack into a catastrophe. Operation Luettich launched to save the German position in Normandy. 2 weeks later, the 7th Army lay wrecked between Falaise and Chambois, and the road to Paris was open. The Thunderbolt did not do it alone, and it did not do it the way the headline said. It did something harder to photograph and just as decisive. It made the daylight belong to the other side.